I'm Shelagh Whitley. I'm a research fellow with the Overseas Development Institute based here in London. And I'm going to talk about a piece of research that we did jointly with Oil Change International. And I'd like Sam Picard to raise his hand, who's a co-author on the paper, who's here as well, and Greg and Hannah, who are here as well from Oil Change, in case you have questions for others who've been sort of part of this research and part of a bigger program of work that we're doing around fossil fuel subsidies. So just to kind of put this in the context of the wider work that we're doing at the Overseas Development Institute, we have kind of an expanding program of work looking at, I guess, the dynamics between the public and the private sectors in the context of climate change, particularly from my research perspective in the context of climate finance. And so we're looking at these questions of sort of subsidies and investment, or incentives and investment, depending on who we're talking to, in the context of a number of sectors and across sort of issues like deforestation and other issues, so not just fossil fuels. Some of you will know this very well, others less, so I thought I would talk through sort of the definition of what a subsidy is first, just to give some sort of general framing to what we do and how we choose to look at what we look at. So we use the definition of subsidies of the WTO, which is agreed by 150 plus countries. So any contribution from government or an agent of government which confers a benefit on its recipient in kind of comparison to other market participants. And the WTO sort of expands on that definition and gives you a bunch of categories of things. So it includes direct contributions by government, tax breaks from government, it includes debt, equity, guarantee, provision, which we in our research call public finance. And then it also includes provision of infrastructure, goods and services below market value. And we use a kind of proxy for that, looking at investment by state-owned enterprise. So we use three categories, and you'll see these again, which we call national subsidies, which are these tax breaks and direct support. As I said, we have public finance, of which only a portion is a subsidy, but because public financiers won't tell you what portion is a subsidy, we capture that data and those numbers. And then investment by state-owned enterprise, again, only a portion of that will be a subsidy, but there's not enough transparency to know how much, so we just give you the information and the background and the figures. So why is it important to talk about subsidies? And a lot of people will talk about subsidies in kind of a negative way. It often has a very negative connotation. We think it's important to look at subsidies both in terms of the fact that we may be supporting things that we don't want to be, and in the context of this conference that would be supporting fossil fuels. But we also think it's important to think about the fact that government has all of these tools and they use them all the time, and they can be used for amazing things and things that we may want them to use them for. So understanding these tools and how they work and the impacts that they have on investment is very important. And I just showed this example, which is from work by Mariana Mazzucato, and I highly recommend her book every single time I present to anyone, which is called Entrepreneurial State, where she's done work looking at government support to innovation, and in particular showing how government has pretty much been responsible for all the technologies in the iPhone, etc. So we often hear about how amazing Steve Jobs is, but we don't often hear about the role of government, so that's part of what we're focusing on. And this is just a sort of repeat from Bill Gates, who I suppose is not really an energy sector expert, but who, it's good, I think it's really important to see business people talking about that role of government, how important it is, and how we have to recognize that if we don't have those tools being used in the right direction, we're not going to get the outcomes that we want to see. So getting to research, I'm not going to dwell on this slide because I'm sure this has been talked about over and over and over again, but the reason that we've done research that we did on the G20 exploration subsidies is because we wanted to look at subsidies to fossil fuels, and if we know, or if some of us believe, that 2/3 of fossil fuels need to stay in the ground to meet the 2-degree target, and I think even that ratio has now been changing over time, because this is from data from last year, probably 2 years ago. That probably the most egregious fossil fuel subsidies would be the ones that are going to exploration. So the ones that are going to looking for more fossil fuels now, and that governments are providing to look for more fossil fuels currently. And again, the reason why we sort of think it's important to look at this is because governments have actually committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, and they have committed to phasing out what they call, in the case of the G20, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And so we would argue that if we're saying 2/3 of fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground, perhaps exploration subsidies would be the first ones you'd want to get more information on and try to unpick a bit to think about how you might start to reform those and phase those out. But it's a critical year for someone like me who works on climate and development, because we have the SDGs, which are currently, I haven't been following it that closely, it may be that there's final text out, but there was draft text on subsidy reform in the SDGs. There's text on subsidy reform in the ADIS Finance for Development goals. There's still some draft language in the Paris Agreement around subsidy reform. And the APEC countries, the G20 countries, and the EU countries have all already committed to subsidy reform. So this is something that, even though there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action, there's potential for these subsidies to be reformed, so we need to at least start to understand what they are. So just to give you a sense of what we looked at in this report, and you'll see a similar slide again at the end, because I'll show you what we're doing in kind of current research. Just to show you the sort of phase of production or exploration and production that we looked at. So we were trying to isolate exploration subsidies, but it's very difficult because a lot of the government support sort of overlaps. There's often mechanisms that are overlapping over extraction and exploration, but where we could, we've identified kind of pure exploration subsidies, but in a number of cases we had to say it was a combination of exploration and extraction, and we couldn't make that difference. And we tried to look at oil, gas, and coal across the G20 countries. We are looking at exploration subsidies, so these are the subsidies that are happening in kind of pre-production phase and reduce exploration costs. There are a number of subsidies that, of course, reduce the overall cost and are focused more on the production phase and could be seen to reduce the cost of exploration, but we haven't included these production subsidies in the work from last year, but we will be including them in work that we're doing now that I'll talk about at the end. So this is just to give you a sense of what we've found, and I guess it's probably worth putting into context, why would we even be doing this, and why do we need to kind of gather this information together? There are a number of groups who will have seen the kind of big high-level numbers from the IMF. You'll have seen the detailed OECD inventory that came out this year that is a recent update. But we don't have good data on this. The IMF primarily uses OECD and IEA data and then does some of its own analysis. The OECD is only collecting information on these national subsidies, so if you hear about those numbers, you're not going to get a sense of the portions of subsidies that are coming through public finance and investment by state-owned enterprise. Again, also, the reason we want to talk about public finance and investment by state-owned enterprises, these are, again, the sorts of tools that we could be using in the green energy space. So if you can start to show how much governments are setting up these institutions, using them to support conventional energy, you can see the potential for that shift, so that this is not something new we need to do, we just sort of need to do it differently. So just in terms of matching you can see in here, you get a sense that there's data gaps. So there's places where we just don't have any information. You'll also see this starts to show you how governments just make very different decisions about how they set up their energy sector, what's public, what's private. In a number of cases, you don't have state-owned enterprises. In other cases, you have huge amounts of investment by state-owned enterprises. So what we see is the highest level of national subsidies are in Australia, China, in exploration, is Australia, China, the UK, and the US. Investment by state-owned enterprise, not surprising, is in countries like Brazil, China, India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. And then public finance isn't coming through as clearly, but the highest levels are actually from Japan and Korea, and then Canada and China. So this is basically the kind of cross-cutting data that we have, and what we have to accompany the paper is a paper on every single country. So there's 8 to 10 pages on each of these countries, which enumerate all of the instruments that we've gathered here, the policies behind them, a bit of background about the countries, kind of focus on exploration. And I guess I should say that the investment by state enterprise in the public finance is also not just domestic. So we include the international public finance and the international investment by SOEs. So you're getting, what is China spending in Africa on fossil fuel exploration is captured in this. So overall, and anyone who works on subsidies should tell you should never add these numbers together, but we did because it's the only way to get anyone to pay any attention to this work. So overall, we call it government support. We have 88 billion of government support to fossil fuel exploration on average annual basis. And that's, there's a lot of that is investment by state-owned enterprise. As we said, only a portion of that is a subsidy, 49 billion. Then these national subsidies, 23 billion, and public finance, 16 billion. And as we all know, and was just raised, the data on the private investment side is very hard to find, and you have to pay money to get it. But using Rystad data, what we did to just compare, this is G20 government support. If you look at what private companies are investing in parallel, the top 20 oil and gas companies, we couldn't include coal because we couldn't get data, is 37 billion. So the question is, would that 37 billion be happening without this 88 billion? How much of it would happen on its own? And really, it's also highlighting, I think part of the research from my perspective came from looking at what was happening in the divestment movement. And divestment is very important, but when governments are doing a lot of this, there's only so much we can achieve through divestment. So then just quickly, and again, this is bringing up kind of questions about Rystad data, but because often governments will say, well, we get so much tax revenue from this, so it makes sense for us to provide subsidies. We did some very early analysis just trying to look at tax take in the G20 countries. We haven't done that as a comparison to subsidies, and I think we're going to try to look at this a little bit more this year. But what you find is obviously there are certain countries which have huge amounts of tax take, so 90% in the case of Saudi Arabia. But that, the vast majority are kind of under, or at least more than half are earning under 3%. So on average, if you take out Saudi Arabia, it's about 8% of total income for governments is coming from oil and gas. Well, yes, from oil and gas only because we don't have coal data. I think part of this is also to try to understand, what are the opportunities to transition tax take to other revenue sources for governments. There's obviously going to be certain governments where it's going to be a much more difficult transition, and then others where it might not be as painful. Then just in terms of data transparency, and because we're here in the UK, we thought it was interesting to show, and this is also in the report, countries where you can actually see who the beneficiaries are of these subsidies. We actually can only do that for the UK, and only for North Sea oil and gas. So they provide transparent data on the field allowances. So you can look at those, and we actually worked a bit with DEC to make sure that the Department of Energy and Climate Change, just to make sure we were getting this right. It looks, across 5 years from September 2009 to September 2014, it's about 4.5 billion, which is at the bottom altogether. And we just think it's interesting also to see the range of countries that are benefiting. So you'll often see, this is about UK investment, UK tax take, UK jobs, but you're also getting subsidies to a whole bunch of companies that are headquartered in other countries. I'm going to skip this. Well, actually, how much time do I have?
You're doing well.
I'm quite fast. I'll show this. It's good.
You've got another 8 minutes.
Okay, it's a bit controversial, so maybe I'll show it anyway. And it's sort of part of what we're trying to understand is this links between subsidies and investment. And the data, as I've sort of tried to show, is not good. But what we did was take international data for investment in fossil fuels and renewables, and subsidies to renewables and subsidies to fossil fuels, and sort of looked at the kind of question of how much investment do you get from these subsidies. Now, obviously, there's weaknesses in kind of a lot of the granular data, but I think what we would like to try to do is to try to start to get this analysis done, not at a global level, but at a country by country level. And we have a proposal to do that actually for the UK that we're developing, to try to really look at the full spectrum of energy subsidies and investment, and try to get a sense of trends over time. And we're doing this in some other countries as well. Because this is, I guess we would argue, it could be quite compelling for policymakers to start to see this and to try to understand, one, what's needed for the transition, and what's the starting point that we're at now. We also did some comparisons from the research, just again to try to kind of create greater impact from the work that we were doing. So trying to compare the numbers of the 88 billion in government support to support for energy access for the 1.3 people who don't have it. Comparing that to climate finance, so looking at the GCF, Green Climate Fund pledges versus subsidies and public finance from those GCF countries. We've also, I guess this is more linking to current work and work that we're trying to develop now, is, I guess really trying to bring this into, the kind of taking it from here's the data perspective, but trying to move more into the question of how we actually achieve subsidy reform. And we see what's happening, and it's been brought up, and it's kind of on the cover of the FT today, the impact that subsidies have, both their provision and their removal on investment, and the kind of power that governments have to make those decisions, and I guess also the links that we have between the oil industry and governments, and trying to kind of talk about this in a way that's more explicit. most of the time you won't hear the word subsidy mentioned in the news. It's not something, if governments are providing it, they will call it something else. The industry won't call it that even when it's trying to kind of get it or to get rid of it. And so we're trying to kind of talk more about how do we move on to kind of the reform phase as opposed to just to the data phase. We have two papers coming out with the new climate economy project the week after next. One that's a global paper looking at how do you actually do fossil fuel subsidy reform, and we have 15 country case studies that are in that. And on the production side of things, we have reform stories for Germany and I'm blanking. Oh, and Canada. Sorry, I'm Canadian. I should remember that. And then the next piece of research that we have coming up for the G20 this year in Turkey is looking at production subsidies. So we're going to not just look at it up to the exploration phase. We're going to look all the way through fossil fuel production for oil, gas, and coal, again for the G20, and we'll also be looking at that, including inputs to power production. And again, that will be 19 country studies and then a full report. And those country studies will actually be accompanied by data spreadsheets, because there's so much information when you start getting into production subsidies that, we have to go into Excel mode. But that'll be published on the 11th of November is the plan. So that's it. Thank you.